Thank you kindly, Mr. President. I appreciate what you're doing with my place. My friends, it is indeed an honor to engage such an august delegation this afternoon here at my farms, at my beloved Mount Vernon. It is my sincere hope that you all shall accept our warm and our sincere Virginia hospitality, and to avail yourselves of the beauty and the comforts of this estate. As this confabulation today centers upon the badge of military merit, the heart of purple, I cannot help but think back. It is important, I believe, that all of you understand not simply my general order given this day in 1782, but the context leading up to that day. Thusly, with your grace and your understanding, I shall spin back a bit. It is something that a fellow with white hair at my age does with some regularity. I will think back to the great and last years of our contest, our War of Independence. Upon reflecting on those final years, the greatly reduced army, most of the men and officers having returned to their homes after our victory at the Yorktown. The remaining army, it was encamped in New Windsor, my headquarters just across the river at Newburgh, both of them in New York. The war was winding inexorably down. We awaited the peace, but alas, King George was very slow to sign the Treaty of Paris. Thus the wait continued. 7 years of war up to that point. Allow me to go back even further. I find myself remembering the road to independency itself. I remember well the systematic usurpation of our liberties by our lordly masters in Great Britain. I remember the first meeting of the Continental Congress in 1774 in Philadelphia City. It was a time when total strangers from 13 separate countries, for that is how we thought of ourselves. My country was Virginia. Total strangers came together as Americans for the very first time. I own to the fact that this idea of coming together, disparate peoples from 13 separate countries, is a theme that plays through the entire history of the early days of the nation. Indeed, much of my thinking behind my creation of the Purple Heart. 6 months after the first Congress met, we were engaged in a shooting war. We had voted in our second Congress to take up arms against our king, something that no colony in the history of humankind had ever done successfully. And our rebellion, as the king called it, was against the most powerful fighting force in the entire world. I was appointed by that Congress to be the commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army of the United Colonies of America. We would not declare independency for 13 more months. Against all odds, we succeeded in driving the British out of Boston town, but not before terrible losses at Bunkers and Breed's Hills, and the difficult winter that followed, the siege. I shall always remember, during the New England War, because that is what we called the early days of the war, I got my first glimpse at the true mettle of the American soldier. My army moved down nigh on to New York City, the Long Island, and awaited the British landing there. It was in New York that I received a letter from Mr. John Hancock informing me that the Congress had declared independency. My friends, at the time we cut the bonds that tied us to the king, we were the only country not under the control of men and women of absolute power. While our cause was glorious, our declaration, it had stirred up a hornet's nest. The British pushed us off of the Long Island, pushed us off of York Island, forgive me, you know it as Manhattan Island, drove us in retreat across the Jerseys. You know, retreat is always a miserable business. Retreat across New Jersey, something altogether worse. We crossed into Pennsylvania, where the Redcoats stopped on the Jersey side of the Delaware River, figuring we were a ragtag civilian army that we would not last the winter. So disdainful of our abilities were the red-coated gentry that the British, General Howe, he pulled all the way back to New York City, much of his army, New Brunswick, New Jersey, leaving small garrisons at posts such as Trenton and Princetown. We took advantage of this, and desperate for supplies, we successfully attacked these posts. I witnessed yet again the hearts and the abilities of the American soldier. This led us into the summer of 1777. The British leave New York City, but for where? To the northward, to the southward, to Philadelphia, the capital of our newly formed nation. So uncertain was this period that I was forced to wheel an exhausted army betwixt New England and the southward, with New Jersey as the axis. It ultimately became clear that Philadelphia was the target. In an attempt to thwart the British plan, we met the enemy and we met defeat at Brandywine Creek. Our troops were massacred in Paoli. We lost the capital. And in an attempt to reclaim Philadelphia, we initially succeeded, but ultimately fell at the Battle of Germantown. And despite a victory at Saratoga, my troops were faced with yet another nightmare of a winter as we went into an encampment at the Valley of the Forge. We suffered greatly there, but we also came together in a unified fighting force for the first time, and we marched out of that valley 6 months after we entered it with the formal recognition and support of a very strong ally, France. After Monmouth, the largest artillery battle of the war, the brunt of the action shifts to the southward. We saw victory, we saw defeat in many skirmishes and battles, until we lay siege to British Lord General Cornwallis. A decisive victory for America. With much of the army subsequently disbanded, the remaining soldiers moved back to the northward, to the Hudson Valley in New York State. And we had time to think. The soldiery had little to do. Not a good thing when soldiers have very little to do, believe me. I found myself busy trying to convince many of the members of the Congress that the war was not over, that if we disbanded the army, as some suggested, the British, who still occupied New York, who still occupied many forts on our western wilderness, and who could, at the drop of a hat, swoop down from Canada, the enemy would take back the new nation. When I was not involved there with the Congress, my thoughts went to the soldiery, to the incapacitating factors that were common throughout the entirety of the war, particularly the common soldier and the non-commissioned lower-ranking officers. An idea began to form. It is important that you understand what my army faced at this juncture. You may find this surprising, but it seemed as if our real enemy then was not the British per se. It was not the weather. What it was, the self-interest and greed of American merchants, combined with the slow-acting, overly deliberative nature of Congress. A Congress with the responsibility to do everything and the power under the Articles of Confederation to do nothing. And because of these factors, we, the Army, did without almost everything necessary to support military operations. Unless you could have seen the trials and tribulations suffered by my soldiers earlier in the war as well as in our final encampment, and almost all of them submitting to these pains with nary a murmur. Unless you could have seen it, you cannot enough admire the strength the endurance, the bravery of the soldier. But now we had a new enemy that threatened the army, and by connection, that threatened the country. Looking at these men, so many of whom fought and acted with unusual gallantry in battles past, looking upon these soldiers' extraordinary fidelity and essential service, I saw something new. The idleness I have just spoken of, soldiery having nothing to do, the building anger by the officers towards the Congress just mentioned, it was leading to talk of a military insurrection. We came very close to a calamitous conclusion to our glorious cause, to the brink of an uprising by the Continental officers, sick and tired of being promised everything by a Congress that could deliver nothing, not even a soldier's pay. With, I believe, the interposition of divine providence, this ultimately came to naught. But the soldiery and officers were still in a state of upset. I saw an opportunity. One of the many ways I chose to recognize extraordinary service and to also mitigate the soldiers' upset and plight, indeed to raise their spirits, was to think back on what had brought us together in this war of independency. I ask you to do so now. Think back. What was it that I mentioned earlier in my comments just now? The theme that plays throughout the story of the formation of our nation, like the chorus oft repeated of a wonderful song. 13 independent countries coming together. Unity, a more perfect union. Standing together with a common cause and shared vision to obtain the ideal, the shining example, and that is what was behind the Purple Heart in 1782 on this very day. And it was the soldier and the non-commissioned officer that were eligible to be so recognized, not solely commissioned officers who had up to this point been the recipients in armies all over the world, mind you, of any accolades so bestowed. In this country, earn glory and be recognized for it. The badge was sincerely appreciated by the soldiers, lauded, cheered, admired, even coveted. After all, its bearer could pass through guard posts without being challenged for a daily password. No small privilege, I will tell you. Once again, we were unified. We were a band of brothers, willing and ready to die for each other, reconnected to our service, and most important, to our country. Thusly, you now understand the context of those times from which a badge of military merit, a Purple Heart, was created. A time when, as Americans must always, ultimately do, we acted in an honorable and virtuous manner. We did what our nation requires its citizens to do so that we may flourish. For remember, when we assumed the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen. What we must always do to succeed as a nation, which will serve as a beacon light to the world, is to set aside faction, to set aside division, and to come together in union. Remember the motto of this country at the time of its birth. E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. I remain your humble and obedient servant.